So everything is as strange and awful as it can possibly be. So, so the first thing I want to say is that while I'm going to take seriously the responsibility of trying to attempt to finish the semester with all of us, since we are in a global pandemic, I do not want any of us, you, me, any of us, to sweat things, right? So, if you need time on a due date, if you need something like that, I myself am just catching up with getting your drafts back to you. About half of you have gotten comments back now on this point. I'm gonna work through that today and tomorrow as well. Yeah, we're just not gonna sweat it since you all can voluntarily take pass-fail at the end of the term anyway. That being said, the thing that's a shame is that I really like the stories that I picked for the second part of the course. It's a really interesting part of Russian literary history and really divergent in ways. We sort of had this continuum that worked together pretty well throughout our discussion of 19th century literature. And as you kind of saw when we moved on to Nabokov, the 20th century gets different in a lot of ways. So I wish we'd be able to talk about that in person, but we can't. So here we are. So I pared down the syllabus, and we're just going to talk about My First Goose by Babel and Poverty by Zoshchenko, though the other stories, Salt by Babel and the other stories by Zoshchenko, are super, super short. So if you're just interested, if you sort of want to check out other of their work, I mean, it's literally it would be just a few minutes of reading. So I'm just throwing that out there. So, okay, we are talking about the period of Russian literature that comes before Stalinism, but sort of during and after the Revolution and the Civil War. 1917, there is a popular uprising against the Tsar. World War I has been a catastrophe for the Russian people. Millions of people have died. Tsar Nicholas and his wife are incompetent and brutal and stupid people. Just not fit to rule a country at all, and have caused the deaths at that point of so many Russians. And in March of 1917, there is just a people's uprising against the Tsar and his family. And they're deposed. We spend the greater part of that year with various Russian political factions not able to govern themselves out of a paper bag. Most significantly, there's only one political party at the time that says that they are willing to end the disastrous war. They're willing to do it right now. And it's the Bolsheviks. And then in October of that year, Lenin rolls into town, finally. He had been exiled in Germany. He manages to get back into town. The Navy around Petersburg is on his side, because of course the military wants this disastrous war to end. And now it is the Bolshevik Revolution. The things that we are reading this week, Babel and Zoshchenko, actually have to do with the civil war that comes afterwards. Babel, in particularly, is on the front lines. The Red Army invades Poland, hoping to spread the revolution there. It doesn't work. And Babel volunteers for the army and is sent there as a political officer. And so what this means is that you have all of these people who are now newly freed, who want freedom, who want Bolshevism, who want eventually communism, and in the meantime socialism, but people who literally, we've talked about CERS, we've talked about the class differences, people who barely can read, are learning to read for the first time, have certainly, there went a cat in the background, have certainly not read, sophisticated political writings. And so the Bolshevik Party is really committed to the idea of providing a political education as well as a general education. I must say that, sort of they make widely available works of Russian literature, the kinds that we've read. They start massive education initiatives for the public, massive literacy regimes. But in amongst their soldiery, they send political officers who are not really there to fight, but they are there to sort of ideologically guide, let us say, the men amongst them. And Babel does this work. Now, Isaac Babel is tremendous. His career was not terribly long. He has Red Army stories that My First Goose comes out of. He has another collection called Odessa Stories. He's widely thought of as being a specifically Jewish author because he grows up in Odessa as part of the Jewish community there, which, of course, Russia under the Tsars is one of the most anti-Semitic places on earth. And you can see that he deals in his writings, it's there a little bit in this story and in other ones too, with being Jewish in Russia. Odessa Stories is largely about the Jewish community there. I bring this up because his identity, oh, there's Chief. I bring this up because his identity as a Jew forms part of his writing, right? And is really considered to be an important part of understanding his work in general. So when you think about salt, there's a few things that I sort of want to point out to you that I think are interesting. And then, it will be your job to mull upon this in the entire story when you write your journal entry about it. The first thing I want to point out is the tremendous structure, like the structural precision of this story. The original draft of this story was more than 100 pages long. And he pares it down to the 4 that we see before us. Tremendous work of editing. If anybody's ever done creative writing, that is unbelievable. But the other thing, we've talked before about the fact that one of the ways to sort of see structure in writing is to identify the epiphany or the peripeteia, right? And that the epiphany is a realization that the character has, the peripeteia is is this realization that the reader has. And so if we think about My First Goose, there's this pivot point in the middle of the story, right? And so the conflict here is that he is this little bespectacled intellectual that has been sent among them. I've cautioned us about not necessarily seeing authors in their narrators. But in this case, in this collection of story, it's basically, Harry. In this case, it's basically Babel, right? I mean, he has written loosely fictionalized accounts of his experience in the Red Guard, in the war, and to the point where the other characters that he writes about were recognizable, and some of them got mad in real life, which is awesome. Savitsky, one of the people who their real life counterpart got salty. So this pivot point in the middle of the story, he has been sent among them, these masculine, hyper masculine warriors, right? These Cossack fighters. And we see that, already, when he deals with Savitsky, there's a kind of almost homoeroticism. Right? When he hears about Savitsky, he talks about, and this is something else we can think about, the estrangement of Babel's language. He rose, his breeches purple, his crimson cap cocked to the side, his medals pinned to his chest, splitting the hut in two like a banner splitting the sky. He smelled of perfume and the nauseating coolness of soap. His long legs looked like 2 girls wedged to their shoulders in riding boots. Not like girls' legs, looked like girls, right? And we've talked before about the idea of estrangement in literature. Excuse me. Language that takes everyday things and makes them unsettling and unfamiliar. He does this often in this brief story. And this is one such example, right? That this is 2 girls crammed to their shoulders in riding boots. He talks about the steel and bloom of his youth. There's obviously something that he is both jealous of and attracted to, right? And we see then that kind of strange almost eroticized masculinity brought back later in the Cossacks, the flaxen-haired boy. And of course, at the end, they all end up cuddling together like puppies. So that's an aspect of the story. Excuse me. I promise, to the best of my knowledge, I don't have the Rona. But this pivot point in the story, I'm looking at my own copy here. And I'm going to put this video on pause for a second. I think maybe to cough, if I can fit. No, I'm afraid I don't know how to do that. Oh my God. Okay, well, if I cough, we go. Sorry, your professor is a grandma when it comes to all things technology. They've just rejected him. They throw his belongings into the street. And he sits down with this speech of Lenin's. Because remember, this is what he's here to do. He's here to promulgate Leninism, right? And he just can't make sense of it, right? The beloved sentences struggled toward me over thorny paths, but could not reach me. And this seems to be a moment of epiphany for him. He's got to figure out how he's going to get in amongst these people. Mistress, I said, I need some grub. The old woman raised the dripping whites of her half-blind eyes to me and lowered them again. Comrade, she said after a short silence, all of this makes me want to hang myself. God damn it, I muttered in frustration, shoving her back with my hand. I'm in no mood to start debating with you. And turning around, I saw someone's saber lying nearby. A haughty goose was waddling through the yard, placidly grooming its feathers. I caught the goose and forced it to the ground, its head cracking beneath my boot, cracking and bleeding. Which we'll get this language recalled again at the very end of the story. Its white neck lay stretched out in the dung, and the wings folded down over the slaughtered bird. God damn it, I said, poking at the goose with the saber. Roast it for me, mistress. The old woman, her blindness and her spectacles flashing, picked up the bird, wrapped it in her apron, and hauled it to the kitchen. Comrade, she said, after a short silence, this makes me want to hang myself. And she pulled the door shut behind her. And so there's this tremendous pivot point in this story, like literally smack dab in the middle of the story, where we kill the goose. God damn it, mistress, blah, blah, blah. Comrade, this makes me want to hang myself. Kill the goose. God damn it, mistress, fix me some grub. Comrade, this makes me want to hang myself. Right? This perfect balance. And that killing of that goose is really the pivot point for the entire story. Right? There's the before and the after. And now the Cossacks are onto him. And now he himself has changed. And afterwards, he can do his job with them. He reads in the speech by Lenin, and they're willing to listen to it. He gets his job done, and they all go to sleep together. But he knows something is wrong, right? We could have just ended the story there, but we don't. We get the recalling of the cracked in blood. My heart creaked in blood, it actually says in Russian. My heart was full of murder. Right? So that's such a structural wonder in the middle of the story, and filled with all kinds of correspondences. He is mocked for his spectacles. He bullies the woman in spectacles. The goose, of course, is a symbol of innocence. In its whiteness, what he's killing. What is he killing, right? Symbolically as well as literally. So that, I think, is an important thing to think about in the story. The other thing I would point out for you to mull upon, getting back to this idea of estrangement, is the language he uses in description of the setting. One of the things that's interesting about the story is that even though it's in the first person, he barely says a word about how he feels at any time. But we can sort of read how he feels in the description of the setting and its strangeness. And this is another occasion where a translator has actually held us back. Like, the translator has tried to make it make more sense, but actually taken something away from it. So, for instance, he has the thing with Savitsky. They go out, and in our text, it says, the village street lay before us, and the dying sun in the sky, round and yellow as a pumpkin, breathed its last rosy breath. What it actually says in Russian is, the village street lay before us, round and yellow as a pumpkin. It's the street that he actually says in Russian is round and yellow as a pumpkin. And the dying sun in the sky breathed its last rosy breath. What does that mean? First of all, pumpkins aren't yellow. Second of all, what does it mean to say that the street is like, I said, we've talked about this estrangement, that doesn't, you can't jive it in your mind. You can't assimilate it. And of course, this is when he's feeling so put out. Then we get, later on, this description of the scenery, the smoke that rises, smoke rose, a large pot of boiling pork stood on some bricks in front of the hut. Smoke rose from it as distant smoke rises from the village hut of one's childhood, mixing hunger with intense loneliness inside of me. Remember, he's Jewish. There's no pork smoke in his childhood, right? And so this is, if you're attentive to it, this is hard to assimilate. We kill the goose, right? We get the evening wrapped me in the soothing dampness of her twilight sheets. The evening placed her motherly palms on my burning brow. It's a much different description of setting. It's much easier to understand, and as opposed to these other descriptions of setting that's very unsettling, we can imagine the comfort, right? Like cool sheets, right? We can totally. And then by the end, there's no estrangement, there's no symbols, everything. We're just the six of us slept there, warming each other, our legs tangled under the holes in the roof, which let in the stars, right? So there's something that really radically changes about these setting descriptions over the course of the story, and that might be worth thinking about in terms of what does that reflect, right? So those are some things that I would direct you to about this story and about Salt. And if you want a coda, I will say that this story, the set of stories, Red Army Tales, came out, was enormously popular. To the point where when Stalin comes to power, at the end of the 1920s, he wants Babel to write a similar story collection about Stalin's 5-year plan. Babel has the chance to flee. He doesn't do it. He's genuinely a Bolshevik. He's genuinely, he believes this. He signs up to be a political officer. But everything changes, and we're going to see this after Stalin comes to power. He's obviously got freedom to write about how dreadful and brutal, this is also a topic to consider at this story, how brutal and terrible the people fighting this war are, right? And especially if you read the story Salt, which I said you certainly might as well. It'll take you like 2 minutes. He's critical of the Bolsheviks, even though he believes in the ideology. He's very critical of many of the people that he fights in the army with. And he's free to do that. We think of Soviet literature as being so censorious, so restrictive, and it becomes so. But in this moment, right, prior to Stalinism, there's a great deal of freedom that artists. It is a really interesting time in Russian history, although brief. But in any case, Stalin demands that he write a similar collection of stories about the first 5-year plan, which involves millions of people starving to death, as it turns out. Babel either won't do it or can't do it. The point is, eventually, he's dragged in front of an informal troika, convicted, taken outside, shot. His body is burned. So that was the fate of Isaac Babel in Stalin's Russia. So, all right, now is the time to pause if you want to, and just go focus on Babel. But I'm going to continue then to talk about Zoshchenko, because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So, pause. Okay. So, Mikhail Zoshchenko, he's writing at the same time as Babel, but he's on the home front. And all of his stories, if you look at them, have to do with what's going on in the wake of the revolution and the Bolshevizing of society. And just like Babel, he is a committed Bolshevik to the point where he actually goes up and joins the Writers' Project at the Belomor Canal, which is the first Gulag project in Russian history, and praises Stalin's first prison labor project. He's part of the literary effort to sort of talk about and justify that, and that's his whole own subject. I could go on and on about the collection of Gorky's work that comes out about the White Sea-Baltic Canal. But it's a little beyond our scope, and, you know, these are unusual online times, so I'll skip it. But, point being, Zoshchenko is a Bolshevik, but he's also willing to criticize the Bolsheviks, and he's able to do so at this time. His big project, and this guy is fascinating. So look, so here's the idea of Bolshevism, right? We are going to have a world that is now meant for everybody, a world where everybody can be anything, where lines of class and gender, all sorts of things are broken down, right? And so theoretically, this means that elite fields like writing, that used to be, as we've seen throughout the 19th century, our readings there, for, you know, mostly wealthy and certainly only educated people, at least middle class, right? And no, this should be open to everybody, right? And so Zoshchenko says that what they are building towards is the proletarian writer. He wants the proletarian voice to come to the fore. But of course, like I said, because of education disparities, the profound oppression and inequality that happened under the Tsars, lots of people can't read. They're certainly not used to reading this way. They're not used to writing creatively, right? I mean, and so Mikhail Zoshchenko steps up and he says, I will be the voice of the proletarian writer until we can get authentic proletarian writers. And so he writes, and you can obviously see this in the Voice. Voice is one of the main things to talk about in Zoshchenko's writing. He writes in the Voice, and it's meant to be comical, of the sort of everyday man, right? This sort of, this proletarian everyman in the new Soviet Russia. He writes a huge volume of work. You know, you see all these little short stories. You know, that's his format. That's what he does. People love him. Actually, I mean, there's something sketchy about this. Like, I will be the voice of the proletariat. And it's like, well, who picked you? But they loved him. People loved him. And he got tons and tons of mail, and he worked to answer a lot of it. So he would get from regular people letters that praised his writing, and that talked about how they were trying to become writers themselves. And they would send him drafts of his writing, and he tried to reply to as many of them as he could. He would critique their poems and short stories. He would write back to them with advice and encouragement. And he did this, I mean, just in a tremendous volume. He published some of the exchanges that he had with the would-be proletarian writers out there. I mean, it really was something that he was... Hey, Chief. It really was something that he was committed to in that sense. And I said people responded very well to it. So here with poverty, a couple of things I want to bring up that might, you know, you couldn't suss out the background. In the same way that Babel is discussing and also critiquing what things are like in this early Bolshevik period at the front of the war, Zoshchenko is talking about what this early war period, this early Bolshevik time period is like at home. And so one thing is the state that everything is in, right? We can see that once electrification comes, everything's a filthy mess. And I think one thing that's important to understand is, one, electrification really is, you know, he says in his Voice of the Proletariat, it's the word on everybody's tongue or something, right? And it is. The Bolshevik ethos, its ideology, besides its political specificities, is also fundamentally utopian, and it has an aesthetic. And that aesthetic is very much 20th century Fordist, industrial and industrializing, extremely looking towards the technologically advanced future, And so one, railroad is a big one, that they are going to connect the country with the most advanced possible rail system, radio technology, recording technology, sound technology, things like that. And also that they're going to electrify the country and they're going to industrialize the country. And this is this sort of, you can imagine this kind of like 1920s sci-fi vibe almost. We talk about this in my sci-fi class, that this technological, ironically Fordist, one of the, Lenin loves Ford, even though he is like the most anti-Semitic capitalist on earth at the time. Anyway, this electrification really does stand in many ways for Bolshevism, conceptually, and I said sort of aesthetically as well. So anyway, I mean, if we think about the story in simple symbolic terms, they turn the lights on, the Bolsheviks turn the lights on, and uncover that everything in Russia is dreadful. Okay. The other thing that I want to tell you, so that you can sort of think through your analysis of the story, is this Russian word meshchanstvo, which Zoshchenko talks about a fair amount in some of his writings. And it's difficult to translate, but it's this sort of, it means like petty, middle-class narrow-mindedness. And so again, thinking in communist terms. Lights come on. Everything's a mess. We have a proletarian hero. We can think about, what does he do in response to this? I mean, he's like, oh, God, it's filthy, right? What does he do in response? And then we have his landlady. And I mean, significantly, it's a landlady. I mean, it is still the tenet of socialism everywhere. No more bosses, no more landlords. Right? They are, even though she herself is certainly not rich, she'd be, in Marxist terms, the petty bourgeoisie, right? She's still a landlady, right? She makes money without working, just by owning this property, right? So she's, what does she do? How does she respond to not just electrification, but his response to it, right? His efforts. And one thing that Zoshchenko talked about a lot was that, and I said this is sort of in his other writings, not necessarily in his fiction, though he brings it up, nestled in his fiction in the way that we're sort of seeing it here. That not only do we have to fight against this kind of petty, narrow-minded, petty bourgeoisie, meshchanstvo, in society, the landlords among us, but that we have to fight against it in ourselves as well, right? That attitude of just like, ugh, this can't get better, I can't do it, right? Like this is, and so I think understanding that provides a kind of lens for understanding the symbolism of the story, so that for you to think through. So, okay, that is my discussion of these two for the week. As I said, it's your task to write a journal entry as you normally would with your own analysis, but now also sort of in response to this video. So I would say in terms of grading, though, like I said, we're not sweating anything. We're definitely not sweating anything. To try to ping off something in your journal entry that makes it clear that you watched this video, right? Like that you listen to this and you're responding to something I said here, though of course, like I said, if you want to talk about something you are already fulminating on, that's fine too. And then this is how we're going to proceed. I'm going to keep getting drafts back to people. That's going to go along like it always was, with a little final project due at the end of the term. And if you need anything, send me an email, I guess. And please, as much as you can, stay home and stay safe and wash your hands for a long time. And if anything comes up for you that, like you lose internet access or anything, let me know, right? Because I honestly, who knows what all of our lives are like now that we have retreated in the face of this. to our homes, and I don't want to assume anything about what people have available to them, what they're capable of, what's going on in their lives right now. Certainly if anybody gets sick or somebody in your family gets sick, God forbid, right? Let me know. We will handle anything that comes. Right. So, wash your hands, cuddle your cats. I guess I'll see you in one of these next week.